Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the beginnings of government. How do you create a government system to make an economic system functional? Remember, we're trying to deal with scarcity here, but we're trying to do it as a society. And we have these different systems in place to manage the concept of scarcity the best we can. But now we have to actually create a political system to make sure something like this works. Okay. This is where the ideas of government comes in. Now, before we get into the primary idea of what a government actually is, we got to remember of economics rule number 5. Can you guess what it is? Of course, that is that incentives matter. And people can be incentivized to get their behavior to go one way or another. And we do this in our society by something called a law. Okay. A law, first of all, is a system of rules that regulates the actions of society and may be enforced by penalties. Okay. So it's just basically a set of rules that society determines is okay. And then you enforce them by, like, mainly primarily penalizing you if you do something wrong. Now, for a law to work, two things must take place. Number one, you actually have to define what that law is. The more vague a law is, the more it can be interpreted into something else. And it must be enforceable. You actually must be able to enact a penalty on it. If the law is not defined and the law is not enforceable, it really is a bad law and probably shouldn't exist. Okay. Now, there are three types of laws we're going to discuss. Number one is criminal law. This is when you commit a crime, like it's written down that something is against the law and you've broken it. Now, this involves usually fines or jail time or community service. But when you go to trial for a criminal case and you're in front of a jury, criminal law means, you are found guilty if it's based on what's called beyond a reasonable doubt. It can't be just like, I think you're guilty of breaking the law. No, when you go in front of a jury, you must have guilt that is beyond a reasonable doubt. All right. Now, the second type of law is civil law. We're going to talk about this less, but these are relations between people that are disputes, not necessarily against the law. In fact, you're probably really well versed in this because when somebody says that I am suing you, that is a type of civil law. This usually involves compensation through money, like I'm suing you for money. And in a case like this, it's not really an issue of you're found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's based on what's called a preponderance of evidence. So basically, you can in a civil case be a winner if a jury believes that they think you probably deserve that compensation, that money. Can you actually have a case that involves both criminal and civil cases? And the answer is yes. And the main one is this one. This is O.J. Simpson. He was accused of murdering his estranged girlfriend and her fiance. There was a big court case, and you have the famous scene here when he puts on the gloves. If they don't fit, you must acquit. And a jury found that, there was no beyond reasonable doubt, and so he got off the criminal act of murder. But then the family of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman sued uh, O.J. Simpson for wrongful death, and then they had another case, and in this case, you didn't have to have beyond reasonable doubt. You just had to have a preponderance of evidence. And in that case, a jury pretty much thought he did it, and so awarded the family tens of millions of dollars in a wrongful death case. So you can't have both. By the way, same thing with former President Donald Trump, and in terms of the rape case in 2023 that he went through, where he didn't have a criminal trial regarding rape. The statute of limitations might had expired, but he did have a civil case in which he had to pay the victim restitution. The third type of law is constitutional law. This is relating to an interpretation of the Constitution. This covers all the citizens of the United States, including the president. And usually it means someone is challenging a law or action that is maybe constitutional. Okay. Now, this the understand that when you're dealing with constitutional law, it's a much bigger, broader aspect that's going to cover everybody. It's not just a small case by case interpretation or basis like a civil or criminal trial. Okay. Now, realize that there's no jury either when it comes to constitutional law. It is done by the um, U.S. and state courts. The ultimate authority is the Supreme Court of the United States. There is no jury. They are the nine justices on the Supreme Court. These are the nine justices here. They rule on whether a case is constitutional or not. All you need is a majority to have that case go. Now, when you take laws and you create institutions that enforce and make them, that is simply a government. It's any institution that makes and enforces laws. So in the United States, you have the government, which includes the president, Speaker of the House, who's usually considered one of the top people in all of Congress, and of course, the US Supreme Court. It's the entire institution, the US government, that helps make and enforce those laws. However, are these things also considered government? Is the state of California a government? Well, does it make and enforce law? It does. Therefore, governor and the former governor, California, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Um, this California has a government. What about the city of Ukiah? Well, they have a city council that makes laws, and they have police forces and enforcement of those laws. So you'd have to say, yep, Ukiah is a government. What about the school? Well, does would you consider the principal like a president or governor or mayor? I mean, does the government, the school the high school actually make and enforce laws? Well, kind of. There is a government at Ukiah High School. What about all these different things like clubs or the county or FFA or other countries? Heck, um, you have fraternities and sororities or Boy Scouts. Do they have governments? And the answer is they do. I mean, any organization that makes and enforces laws is government. Now, because governments have different kinds of power, of course they do. But every government has three basic types of power. Number one, legislative power. Legislative power is the power to make law. If you are a legislator, you are a lawmaker. If you're a legislature, you are a group of people that make laws. So the legislative power is the power to make law. Number two is the executive power. That is the power to enforce laws. Okay. To make sure those laws are enacted or they are put into place. So over here on the right, you have Franklin Roosevelt. He is going to Congress right after Pearl Harbor, and he's asking Congress to make a law giving him the authority to go to war with Japan and Germany. Once he's got that authority, he executes the law. He enforces that law goes. Um, Abraham Lincoln here. What law does he enforce? The Constitution, making sure the country stays together. He went to war to enforce the constitutional law saying the Confederate States of America could not break away from the United States. Okay. So legislative is to make law, executive is to enforce the law when it is made. Finally, we have judicial power. This is the power to interpret the law. This is the courts. All right. Because, a law that says like um, if you are speeding it's over 65 miles an hour, that's a really simple law to interpret. It literally says speeding equals 65 miles an hour. But something like freedom of speech, what does that even mean? Or something is something like illegal search, what is that? Cruel and unusual punishment, I don't know what that means. There's all kinds of ways you can interpret rules and laws. And in fact, when you look at the class policies for this class, there are some things that are very like boom, boom, boom. 80% is the mastery check. That law is really simple. You don't need much interpretation. But anything that a teacher considers distracting can be taken away from a student. That's really vague. And it's vague because it allows me, the leader, to interpret what that means and then be able to manage a class that way. So it wasn't by accident. Okay. So you have legislative to make, executive to enforce, judicial to interpret the law. Now, two primary different types of regimes or types of government still all have all these three powers, but a different way to run things. So, a dictatorship is a government run by a single person or a group of people. That single person or group makes, enforces, and interprets laws on their own for the benefit usually of that single person or group of people. A democracy is different. A democracy is a government where decisions are made by people using free and fair elections. And then what happens usually in a democratic government is the power to make law, enforce law, and interpret law is actually separated out so no one group becomes too powerful, especially the group that is enforcing the laws, which those are usually the leaders of the country. Sometimes they become too powerful and they become dictatorships. All right. So you have laws, constitutional, civil, and criminal. You put laws together and you get institutions to make and enforce them. That creates government, and governments have three powers: make law, enforce law, interpret law.